Please welcome the President and Chief Executive Officer of Bridgewater Interiors, Ron Hall. The Executive Vice President, Research Director, and Executive Committee Member at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, Anna Paulson. The President and Chief Executive Officer of Kelly, Peter Quigley. And to moderate the discussion, anchor at WDIV-TV 4 NBC, Devin Scillian.
It's great to be back with you again with our same group because as I recall last year, we nailed everything about 2023. If you check your notes, I believe I predicted the Lions would go to the NFC Championship game even. So it was great. I'm still sitting here hung up on whether a clown car can go bad. Doesn't that just make it more clownish?
Just look at it.
I'm stuck.
Just look at it.
Thanks. What I want to start with, gang, is your thumbnail reflections on what we just heard, your biggest takeaway from the State of the Region report, and whether or not, given what you just heard, your needle is pointing more toward, for the region, prosperity or peril. Peter, let me start with you.
Yeah, I'll start with prosperity. I am a half-full kind of guy. And I do think the opportunity exists, but we clearly, as Sandy mentioned, have work to do when you compare us to the other 20 regions that he did. So we have work to do, and we can't, any one of us or any part of the, whether it's education or government or private organizations, can't do it alone. So the power of the chamber is here to help us marshal our resources to get it to prosperity, not peril.
Anna, how about you?
So let me start by saying I'm speaking just for myself and not for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago or the FOMC or anybody else. I'm kind of a glass half full person too. And so the things that stand out for me are the business starts, right? Those are people putting their own capital and their own ideas to work for the economy of the region and the nation. And so they're taking a risk, they're making a bet, they're pointing towards prosperity. And then the other piece of that are the consumption numbers that Sandy showed you, right? Again, people are saying, I feel comfortable enough about my economic position that I'm gonna go out and buy things. And that's, again, I've got a choice. I could save for the future because I'm worried, or I can spend. And so you're seeing people put that money to work in the economy from the household side and from the business side. And we have also seen a lot of investment over the last year in this region and in the nation as a whole. That all feels good for the future. Mm-hmm. There's a real issue with, in this region and in the country as a whole, we're getting older, population growth is slowing down, and that's been our traditional engine of growth. So that means we need to think about how do we get every possible person who wants to work connected to the labor market, and how do we make technology allow us to be more productive?
Yeah.
Those are the real issues.
Ron, how about you? Peril or prosperity right now?
I hate to be a contrarian out of the box on the first question, but I'm gonna say I'm a little bit more of a glass quarter full kind of person, and I'm particularly thinking about my industry, the automotive industry. I don't think that, and I'm just thinking about the state of Michigan, I don't think that we yet appreciate generally and broadly the significance of the threat to being the dominant space for the industry in North America. You know, as Sandy was just saying in his remarks, the speed with which some of this development is moving south, the decades of capital flight from Michigan and the rest of the upper Midwest, and then this looming threat, particularly from the Chinese manufacturers with EVs. I mean, we don't have another 10 years to talk about it and try to figure out. And I feel like the threat is at our door. And relatedly, and also to the comment about taxpayers being more willing to perhaps invest in infrastructure and education. I hope that's true because I think that the answer, and we saw this in the Grow Michigan Together Council, where I served on one of the committees myself, is education. We really have to get it together and fix our education system and be ready with these jobs that'll keep the industry here.
That education attainment number that we saw there compared to our regional is very, very troubling. I wanted to point out, I heard something funny recently. An optimist sees a glass that's half full, a pessimist sees a glass that's half empty, an engineer sees a glass that is twice as large as it needs to be. I want to ask about this disconnect that Sandy talked about, and we've talked about this. I'm really fascinated by this. We've talked about this on Flashpoint a lot. You know, Peter, it used to be, James Carville taught us all back in the 90s that to distill the way voting worked is it's the economy, stupid. But at the time, what he kind of meant was the way that the economy was going informed how you felt about our political leaders. Now, how we feel about a political leader informs how we feel the economy is doing. This is an interesting conundrum to try to navigate through.
Yeah, it's clearly flipped on its head, and I think the disparity between the consumer spending and sentiment numbers that Sandy showed is a great example of that. I think in the workforce, the same disconnect exists to some extent with the customers that we support. There's been significant wage inflation appreciable at the bottom part of the wage scale, which is great. It's long overdue. But there seems to be a sort of remorse in the middle about security, job security, wage growth, the future of jobs. And I think, although it's not directly related to consumer sentiment, I do think that the workforce is also struggling with this sort of angst about the future.
Yeah. And it's funny, the disclaimer that you feel like you have to give all the time about I'm speaking as myself. You must feel that way when you go to get your hair done. Look, I'm not speaking for the Federal Reserve today.
Exactly. I'm making my own choices.
But Sandy just gave the Fed a lot of credit for the way that we've seen inflation reined in. I'm curious as to, given what you know and the way that that's gone, how you feel when you see people being so negative about the economy.
So I think there's when I think about how people are feeling, I think you can square some of that by looking at both what's happened over the last year and then what lies ahead. And, you know, people have experienced things getting better over the last year, right? The economy grew a lot faster than we thought it was going to. We made a lot more progress on inflation than we expected. But when we look ahead, we expect a little slower growth. And people are responding to that, right? Mm-hmm. We saw, you know, wages go up a lot over the last year and up in real terms, which is tremendous, especially for the folks at the bottom end of the income distribution. They really benefited a lot from that. But they don't think that's going to continue. Yeah. And neither do, you know, economists or people making, you know, forecasts about the future. Yeah. So in some sense, they're exactly right that, you know, what we're hoping and what we're projecting right now is that we're going to see inflation continue to come slowly down and get back to 2%, and so we can stop talking about it, and it can stop being at the front of everybody's minds when they're making business decisions or family budgeting decisions, and that's how it's supposed to be. That's how you know when the Fed's achieved its goal. And we're also expecting economic growth to slow down a little bit, yeah. And those two things kind of go together. Yeah. And so there's something, you know, very, you know, I think logical about how people are saying, like, yeah, you know, things are going to slow. And whenever things slow, there's a little peril. Are they going to get right to that sweet spot, right, or are they going to tip over further? So people have, you know, sensible to be concerned about both of those.
So what are you going to do about interest rates next month?
I'll get back to you.
Just in case you lost your mind, I didn't want to miss the opportunity. Ron, you and I talked about this last week, though. I as the father of 4 millennials, they are all fairly pessimistic about their own personal economies, and it goes to what Sandy talked about. Those grocery prices is what they feel. And you talked about, I believe the phrase you used last week when we talked was a hollowing in the middle. Talk about that a little bit.
So first of all, I don't have 4 millennials. Between us, we have 4 millennials. I don't have that many older children. My sense is that, you know, there's a lot of the angst that you read about and hear about is this, you know, this hyper competition kind of in the middle of the economy, right? We talk about income and wealth distribution, and people at the upper end more or less doing fine economically. people at the lower end are used to struggling, and this is just kind of more struggle for them. But then, like my kids, a handful of years out of college, just getting going in their careers, had some expectations about how that might go that haven't been met in all cases. And I just think, people finding the grind harder than they anticipated, I think maybe contributes to some of this malaise that we read about in survey after survey that just doesn't match the data. As we can see.
Because Anna, it's interesting, inflation can retreat, but the prices don't, right? They stay in place. It's tricky. I want to talk a little bit about the population growth effort that the governor has started. It's interesting, Peter. A friend of mine who I rely on for so much of what's going on politically in Lansing has been kind of bemused lately talking about this effort of the governor and it's like, where have people been? And by the way, for those of you unfamiliar with the frog comparison, the old adage is that if you put a frog in boiling water, he jumps out so quickly that he doesn't get burned. But if you put him in a pot of cold water and slowly turn up the heat, by the time he realizes it's time to jump out, he's already cooked. And Peter, that's what this friend of mine was saying is, where have people been? Sandy's right, the house has been burning for ages, and for us to just now start to act like this is that we're a little slow on the switch here.
Yeah, for sure, and it's as Sandy said, it's not a quick fix. It's a generational fix, and so the work has to start today. I think in addition to just population growth generally, the impact on the labor force is also very important. The same underlying issues that confront us with respect to population growth also confront us with respect to labor force growth and participation. So we're an aging workforce, and Anna, thank you for not looking at me when you said we're an aging workforce. We have individuals getting married later in life. They're not having as many children. This is going to be Captain Obvious, but we don't have a smooth running immigration system that has historically oftentimes complemented our workforce and the population. So we have a number of things that, as the council identified, that need both policy and process fixes. And until we do that, until we again turn the attention of our education systems, because pre-K to beyond secondary is absolutely critical to attracting people to the state. We have some great, wonderful natural resources, a great secondary school system, university school systems. But we have work to do for sure.
Yeah, and this is where the peril is. If we can't grow, to be 49th is beyond a crisis point, right? In population growth, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, there's if you look at the numbers for the entire country, right? Michigan is facing a more dramatic version of what most of the country is facing, right? As a country, we're getting older and population growth is slowing for all the reasons that Peter was talking about. And so that does make it critical to think about, for the folks who are here, how do we make sure that they are productively engaged with the economy? My colleagues and I have been having lots of conversations with folks in Michigan and in Illinois and Indiana about access to childcare. And one of the things that you see behind those high labor force participation numbers that's kind of interesting is post-pandemic, women's labor force participation, particularly for women with kids, is a little higher than it was pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
Which is really again, I'm in the half full camp, and Ron's like, it's never gonna happen. But how do you keep, so how do you remove the barriers to being in the labor force for people who really wanna be? And that takes a lot of work on the ground, that takes a lot of listening, that takes a lot of partnership. Those aren't easy conversations to have. Definitely easier when you have more people, but then you've got to think about how do you make sure that the folks who are here can realize their potential.
Yeah. Ron, I've been trying to hang on to this faith that the climate problems in the world were going to hold Michigan in good stead, that we were going to end up with a lot of climate sort of refugees. There's people in Florida who can't even get homeowners insurance anymore because of hurricanes, and people in California can't get them because of earthquake problems and mudslides. So help me either hang on to my optimism or dismiss me of it.
I'm optimistic on that point.
On this part?
Actually,
Okay, good.
I think, surrounded by the Great Lakes, we talked about, Sandy referenced the lower cost of living here. I still think that over time, we've got an opportunity to improve our placemaking and have that be an important lever in drawing, especially younger, working talent to the state.
Yeah.
I think that's very possible. I've talked to several people from the Traverse City region, who talk about the way Traverse City has just exploded since the pandemic with the ability of people to work remotely more often. They got some challenges that go with that, but there's certainly some economic upsides for them. I think that, industries are beginning to adapt to the notion that there's going to be a huge cross-section of the workforce that's, not going to ever return to the office 5 days a week. People are going to expect to be able to live in one part of the country and work in another. One of those millennial children we were just talking about of mine does that. My son works for a firm that has its brick and mortar in San Francisco. He's part of one person on a Midwest team of 3, one in Detroit, one in Chicago, one in Minneapolis, and the manager for those 3 people is in Berlin. And and he works from his apartment in the West Village. And so I'm just kind of like, I couldn't have dreamt of that, a generation ago. And so I think that if we get creative about keeping people like him here and addressing the aspects of living in the region that will appeal to knowledge workers.
This is where, in fact, you teed this up perfectly. This is what I wanted to move to next, was trying to figure out the future of work. And it seems to me that whoever figures that out first is obviously going to have a really nice head start. Peter, it's funny, the old time-honored tradition of blaming the previous administration for something. Now, how long can we blame the pandemic for things? But some things are permanent, and what Ron's talking about, the expectation of how work should... We're seeing more employers really do want to return to the workplace, but we're kind of at loggerheads with workers who may have their own idea. Give me a thumbnail on the future of work here.
Yeah, I think we're hitting on a number of really important trends when it comes to attracting people, but the post-pandemic environment clearly has shifted the workplace, the workforce, the work time, work style, I would say forever, because based on, you look at, and we look at what words appear in job descriptions, what words appear in job postings, what people respond to when they leave a company, what they respond to when they're attracted to a company. And flexibility is a very important ingredient in many of the columns I just mentioned. And it doesn't have to necessarily be 5 days a week. In fact, the Gen Zers prefer not to be remote 5 days a week because they want the social stimulation and the relationship building that goes on at a workplace. But clearly, employers that provide some level of flexibility to their workforce, I think will be a more attractive and have higher rates of retention than somebody that insists on 5 days a week.
That's tricky because that means that we can, Michigan companies can hire people who live elsewhere, but we don't necessarily get the benefit of their residency, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Works both ways. Anna, you want to talk a little bit about how, and if there's any residue of the pandemic you want to talk about too, lingering in the economy?
So I think it'll take a little bit of time for us to really figure out what from the pandemic is lasting and what isn't. I do think that we all learned that we can work differently, and we're seeing that play out all the time. And that combines with these demographic forces that we've been talking about, where essentially, if you're an employer, workers are fundamentally scarce in a place that's growing slowly. And so you've got to think about how you're going to attract people. And so you want that to work for both sides, and you don't want turnover to be high. I think that's one of the things that companies struggled with a lot during the pandemic, when we saw unemployment go up and then come back down really quickly, and people were like, oh my gosh, how do I recreate these long-standing relationships that I had counted on? There has to be a little bit more in it for both sides, is I think one of the things that we've learned. Yeah. And so That basic, who has the bargaining power for, fundamentally in a place where we're growing solely from a population perspective, but we have a lot of business opportunity, a lot of business dynamism, both sides have to be part of that conversation.
Yeah. Ron, the future of work in the auto world occupied an awful lot of the headlines over the last couple of months of 2023. I was riveted by watching the back and forth over the UAW contract and trying to figure out how things like artificial intelligence and robotics were going to fit into this piece. And we found, I think, if there's a labor leader in America now, it's probably Shawn Fain, who, give me your take on what all that meant to the future of work in Michigan.
In my 25-year or so career in automotive now, I hadn't seen a round of labor talks as difficult as what the industry just endured. And so at the beginning, I didn't know, listening to the people who are even senior to me in the industry, whether this sense of panic was justified or not, or whether everybody was just mad because we knew they were going to wring bigger contracts out of us. But I'm hearing more and more, and I believe it, that there's a little bit more of a systemic shift going on. I heard from a leader of a big data analytics firm that all these data analysts were being sucked in by automakers right after the contracts were signed, all looking to figure out how they could accelerate the move of manufacturing away from the upper Midwest and away from the UAW. And you're seeing, company leaders from the automakers talking out, Jim Farley just talked about this recently again. Mm-hmm. But they're doing it, and for the first time as a tier one supplier, we're talking about modularity, and decreasing our human labor and having more modular work done south of the border and brought here and dedicating all kinds of resources to look at that. That's never happened before in my career. Yeah. And so I definitely think there's going to be a reaction. And I think, we're going to see it sooner rather than later, meaning, in less than 5 years, not more, as some of these things come to fruition. But, for every action, there's a reaction. We know that, trade laws are not stagnant. I don't know that that the Chinese are going to be able to flood the market the way they're hoping will be allowed, especially depending upon how things play out in November. So I think, a lot's got to play out. But to Sandy's point, we know we need to be smarter. We know we need to be able to lead this technology revolution. And if we do that, there will be a place for us.
After the contract was signed, of course, the non-union automakers had to adjust, and their workers ended up getting a benefit that they weren't really. In fact, Shawn Fain said UAW now stands for "You Are Welcome." Do you see a place for union growth now in not just Michigan, but more importantly, I guess, the South and the American auto industry elsewhere?
I'm skeptical. Yeah. Our company operates a facility in Alabama. That's well known. It's publicly known. And I've been back and forth from that region now for more than 15 years. Mm-hmm. And I tell people all the time, it is difficult to describe how viscerally opposed everyone is to unionization in the South compared to what we know here. Still, politicians talk about it, economic developers talk about it, local officials talk about it, employees talk about it. Yeah. I just have a hard time imagining that culturally the UAW is going to be able to move that needle now. We are happily represented by United Auto Workers here at all three of our Michigan facilities. And so, we're comfortable managing a workforce that's either unionized or not. But no, I just don't see it.
Yeah. Peter, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about artificial intelligence. One of the things that really stayed with me from last year's Mackinac Policy Conference was Mark Cuban, who told the crowd, you don't have to adopt or employ any artificial intelligence, but if you don't understand how it works and the impact it's going to have on your industry, you are dead in the water. Talk a little bit about where you think that's taking Michigan in particular.
Yeah, I think it's happening very quickly, as I think we all know, and Captain Obvious, but If you think about that, to get to 100 million users, it took Instagram 1.5 years, it took TikTok 10 months, it took one of the generative AI 2 months. So the adoption rate is significant, and I agree with Mark that if you're not doing it now, you're behind. And in terms of the impact on work generally, we're already seeing it impact the customers that we deal with in Michigan, but also outside of Michigan as people find new ways of doing work. There are going to be jobs that will be destroyed, but I tend to agree with the World Economic Forum and McKinsey that there are going to be more jobs created than destroyed. And in our own workplace at Kelly, we're deploying generative AI and helping improve the productivity of our recruiters. They don't have to, come up with a list of interview questions, or, I mean, they review them, of course, but the first draft of a job description, the first draft of a line of questions or research about a company we're working with, all of that is going to help, I think, improve the productivity and engagement of our workforce, and I think Michigan could be a leader in this given the huge pool of talent we have. If we directed it in the right places, there have to be guidelines and guardrails. It's not for the faint of heart because it can be misused or just misapplied without those guardrails and guidelines. But I think Michigan could be a leader in the country.
It's not hard to see, though, the dystopian side of this as well. Anna, you have any thoughts on what AI is taking us?
So I think that economists who study data and so on are certainly behind in some sense, right? Because we need to see this play out a little bit. So there's just starting to be some systematic research about how AI is changing the employment landscape. And there's one view that is kind of optimistic, and that is a view that in places, say healthcare, where there's tremendous need and the need is growing, you can have better outcomes with employees who might not need to, go to medical school or take 10 years to learn things, right? So that you can have great health outcomes and lower barriers to productively engaging in that field. And that would make, somebody with a community college degree more productive and then be able to make higher earnings.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the promise. And I think there's a lot to be seen about whether we go in that direction or whether we go in a direction that is much more about here's a whole bunch of jobs that I don't need. One of the things that's really different about this kind of transformation as opposed to some of the transformations that Michigan has been impacted by before is it's not place-based. Right? It is not zeroing in on one occupation or one sector of the economy.
Right.
It's universal. And so that means that it can be much more transformational, but also it doesn't create the same kind of regional difficulties that we've seen from earlier shocks to manufacturing or to trade.
Yeah.
I think that's something that we have to think about from a policy perspective.
With our time left, it's election day in Michigan. I don't want to ask you all to drop a take on who you want to see in the White House come November, but it's pretty easy to see all three of you, your lives being shifted one way or the other, your professional outlook and what's coming your way by what happens in November. So, in fact, particularly you, Ron, with what Sandy was talking about with EVs, somehow electric vehicles have become politicized, which is fascinating on its own. But let each of you talk a little bit about what the shifting tectonic plates might be over the next 10 months or so, 9 months or so.
Well, I'm generally a free market guy. So, if BYD has the best products, then the Detroit firms ought to have to compete with them, and American consumers ought to be able to discover that those are the best products and buy them and have them on the roads here if, that's what consumers want. I think that the more we move away from that, the more problems we're buying for ourselves long term. So I hope that however the whole trade discussion works out, that we lean into what consumers want, balance with the regulatory environment and fossil fuels and all that. But at the end of the day, consumers have to want it and buy it and use it. And we don't want to be the place that isn't, selling the cars and trucks that people actually want. We've seen what happens with the industry in other parts of the world where that's the case. More broadly, I think everybody needs to adopt a bigger sense of, or a big sense of just civic citizenship, right? I mean, we have a great representative democracy. We've got institutions that, have made this, in my view, one of the greatest countries in the world over the last few hundred years. And we get a lot right. For all the things we get wrong, we get a lot right. And I hope that collectively the citizenry will lean into that and support it and not take for granted that everything can remain stable here. We can become an unstable country just like we see on the news in other places. So that's my biggest sense.
Yeah, and in fact, that's as we look at these recommendations that have been put forth on what we need to do to start growing Michigan's population, they're going to take some political cooperation and will, and cooperation is kind of in short supply sometimes in an election year.
Indeed.
Anna, your thoughts?
So for the Fed, we're a public service organization. Congress has given us some goals of price stability and maximum sustainable employment, and that's what we're going to be focused on regardless of how the election goes. And we're going to be focused on the well-being of citizens in the region and understanding the impact of the policies, whatever they are, on the economy, on employment, on inflation, and then designing policy in a way that makes sense given those realities.
Yeah, that's great. And I wasn't trying to set a trap door for you because
I dodged it.
I little tricky.
Yeah, I think in the short term, my biggest concern is that we're paralyzed and that business decisions and other really important decisions in the region, but in the country, are being delayed because the stark contrast between the outcomes. And I just think that's bad for business and bad for organizations. So my hope is that there will be some commitment to continue to try to make progress on really important things like we're talking about today, notwithstanding a big election. From the standpoint of the outcome, I hope it's not a political statement to say what I believe, which is the more people we can put to work in meaningful, safe, productive jobs, it's good for everybody. I think a working economy, a working population creates all sorts of value in our communities, in the region. And so whatever the outcome is, I hope that we have legislators and administrators that share that view and work to reduce the friction that exists in some places that prevent more people from getting meaningful work. And I think that that would be where my hope is and focus post-election.
Hope, because there's this weird fatalism, and I don't know how that will filter out after the election, but right now about 70% of Americans, according to some polls, don't like either choice that they have. And so I wonder if the discontent then bleeds over to, well, this is where, it will be a very interesting post-election time this year for exactly that reason, right? Yeah. That's a great conversation, as always. I think I told you we'd solve the world's problems in 35 minutes and then, actually probably 20. What would we do with the other 15? But thank you all very much. Thanks to our panel here. Big thanks to citizens for providing this great environment and forum for all of us today. Hope you all have it is a beautiful day outside. We've got some more nasty weather coming in later, so let's all get out and enjoy a little bit of it. Thanks so much for being here, for supporting the region, for supporting the chamber, and make sure you get out and vote today. Thanks so much.
Distinguished guests, this concludes our program. Thank you for attending the
Thanks. Great as
2024 State of the Region presented by Citizens. Please join your colleagues for a strolling lunch in the reception area.